All right, so get this. Today we're going deep, really deep, into the story of Matthew Stephen Johnson.
A convicted serial killer.
You got it. And we've got a ton of information to sort through. We've got excerpts from his Wikipedia page.
Court documents.
Oh, yeah, and news articles, the whole 9 yards. And let me tell you, this case, well, it's got some seriously crazy twists and turns.
It's a wild one.
Just to give you a taste, Johnson was convicted of 3 murders.
But they think he might be tied to 2 more.
Exactly. Authorities suspect there could be 2 other victims out there.
And get this.
Oh, here's the real kicker.
He actually claimed that he hadn't slept with a woman since 1982.
Yeah, but the DNA evidence tells a completely different story.
Yeah, that's one of the many things that makes this case so fascinating. It's like a puzzle, but someone's gone and hidden some of the pieces.
Okay, so let's try to put this puzzle together then. Let's start with Johnson's early life. I mean, there's just all this stuff that makes you wonder how he ended up on this path.
Yeah, where did it all start?
Right. So picture this. Big family, Hartford, Connecticut.
9 siblings.
One of 9 siblings,
Ah,
and a twin himself.
wow.
But here's the thing. When he was just 12 years old, he had this pellet gun accident,
Oh, no.
and he lost sight in one eye.
I mean, that kind of trauma, especially at that age, it has to have a lasting impact.
Definitely. And when you look at what we know about his childhood, it paints a pretty complex picture.
Some people described him as a really sweet kid.
But others saw aggression,
Yeah.
like a real struggle with accepting the word no.
Interesting.
And there's more. Records show that he had an intellectual disability, an IQ of 69, and a history of seizures.
So you've got these almost like contrasting elements to his personality, right?
Right.
And then on top of that, these underlying challenges.
Seem complicated.
You can't just look at one thing in isolation when you're trying to understand someone, especially someone who commits these kinds of acts.
Definitely not. There's no simple answer.
It's never black and white.
It's about seeing the whole picture, the whole tapestry,
A big picture.
not just a single thread.
Exactly.
And then things get even more, complicated as we follow Johnson into his teenage years. He was definitely struggling. He even talked about using drugs and alcohol to cope.
Makes sense.
He did manage to get his high school equivalency diploma,
Okay.
and he worked for a bit.
Good.
But then his behavior, I guess you could say it took a turn.
His criminal behavior.
Yeah, it really started escalating.
That's actually a term in criminology, escalation pattern.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's super important when you're trying to analyze criminal behavior. So, like, what might start as petty theft or even vandalism, it can turn into something way more serious for some people.
So it's like a progression.
Exactly.
Wow. And you can see that in Johnson's case.
For sure.
I mean, at just 19, he was already involved in a robbery and assault.
Of a pregnant woman.
Can you imagine?
And then on top of that, he serves 4 years for trying to kill a security guard during another robbery.
Wow, it just keeps getting worse.
It's like every offense is like another step, right?
Yeah.
And in Johnson's case, the steps keep getting higher, more dangerous.
Yeah, and then, just 2 years after that attempted murder, so 1988, he forcefully restrained a woman on the street.
And then 1990, he raped and beat another woman.
That's scary. This string of violence against women, it's like a giant red flag.
It makes you wonder, why didn't those early offenses trigger more of an intervention,
Yeah, like what could have been done differently? What could have maybe stopped this pattern before it got to murder?
It's a question a lot of people ask.
And we'll definitely keep exploring that as we go deeper into the case.
For sure.
But for now, let's talk about the murders, the ones he was actually convicted of.
Okay.
So Johnson was convicted of killing 3 women, Aida Quinones
With Sally Jimenez,
and Elijah Ford.
all between 2000 and 2001.
Tragic. And all 3 of them were sex workers.
Which, sadly, is something we see a lot in serial killer cases.
Yeah, it's like they're targeting those who they think are vulnerable.
Less likely to be missed.
Or even have their cases taken seriously.
Exactly. It really points to this predatory mindset.
Fueled by power and control.
Exactly. Now, what's particularly disturbing about these murders, I mean, aside from the obvious tragedy, is the way he did it. His MO, his modus operandi.
Okay.
So he would lure these women to secluded places,
Okay.
often after having sex with them,
Oh, wow.
and then he would strangle them.
Oh, my God.
But it didn't stop there.
Really?
He would then repeatedly stomp on their necks and their skulls.
It's just, I don't even...
Brutal. It's a level of brutality that's just, it's hard to comprehend.
It's more than just killing, right?
Right. It's rage.
Like pure rage.
It goes way beyond what's needed to just end a life.
It's like something else is going on there.
Deeper psychological issues, maybe.
And remember, we mentioned there might be two other victims, LaDawn Roberts,
And Rosalind Casey.
and their deaths, well, they're similar. So the suspicion that Johnson could be connected, it's definitely there.
Yeah.
So here you have this trail of violence
Years and years of it.
culminating in these brutal murders.
Yeah.
How did they finally catch him?
Well, a lot of it came down to, classic detective work
Yeah.
and the amazing power of forensic science. It was actually a forensic scientist, Henry Lee, who connected the murders using DNA evidence.
Oh, wow. DNA is incredible.
It can link a suspect to a crime scene,
Right.
or like in this case, it can connect crimes that seem totally unrelated.
So what did they find?
Well, in Johnson's case, they found semen, they found blood splatters, they even found cigarette butts on the victims.
Cigarette butts?
Yeah. And from those tiny little pieces of evidence, they built a DNA profile, ran it through a database of convicted sex offenders, and boom, they got a match.
Wow. It's like science itself caught up with them.
Pretty much.
So what happened next?
They arrested him pretty quickly,
When?
January 13th, 2002.
Okay.
And during the trial, Gabriel Jimenez, the brother of Rosalie Jimenez, one of the victims, he gave this really emotional plea for the maximum penalty. But Johnson, he stayed defiant.
Really?
Yeah, he said he felt bad for the families,
Okay.
but he refused to admit he was guilty.
Wow. It's hard to wrap your head around that,
Yeah. How can someone do these terrible things and then just deny, deny, deny?
It's a question that's hard to answer.
It really is.
And get this, even with all the DNA evidence stacked against him, Johnson claimed that he hadn't slept with a woman since 1982.
Which, of course, makes absolutely no sense.
Right. It goes against all the scientific facts.
Totally. So you have to wonder, was he trying to manipulate the system?
Maybe?
Or was this some kind of delusion?
It's hard to know for sure.
It really is.
Well, the court didn't buy it. They sentenced him to 180 years.
Wow.
That's 60 years for each murder, served one after the other. And just when you think it's over, he decides to appeal the verdict in 2008.
Appeals are part of the process, but overturning a conviction based on DNA evidence, it's almost impossible.
So what did he argue?
He wanted separate trials for each murder. And of course, he kept insisting that he hadn't been intimate with any woman since 1982.
Kicking to that story.
Yeah. But the evidence was overwhelming.
Right, so
So the court upheld the original verdict. Johnson stayed behind bars.
makes sense. But even with a conviction, there's still so many questions.
Oh, yeah. Tons of questions. Like, what led Johnson down this dark path?
Right, and could any of this have been prevented?
And can we ever really, truly understand the mind of a serial killer?
Especially one who just won't admit to his crimes.
It's baffling.
It really is. And
Yeah.
we're going to keep trying to answer those questions as we go further to this case. We'll look at the psychological factor.
The societal factor.
All of it.
Everything.
Stay with us.
It really is unsettling,
Yeah, it's hard to believe someone can do those things and then just completely deny everything.
It really makes you think, like, what can we even learn from a case like this? When someone's so deep in denial, how can we even begin to understand, like, their motives, their mindset?
Right? It's almost like trying to understand a completely different species or something.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges in, criminal psychology, trying to understand serial killers. There are always more questions than answers. But, we can look at what criminologists, what psychologists have seen in other cases and see if we can find any patterns that apply here. Like, for example, we know that a lot of serial killers, they get categorized by their motive, like anger
Okay.
or power and control, or even like a twisted sense of sexual gratification.
So where do you think Johnson falls on that spectrum?
Well, I mean, based on what we know about his crimes, I think there's definitely a power and control element there, especially with, how he targeted women he saw as vulnerable and just the level of brutality.
Yeah, it's like he needed to completely dominate them.
Exactly. And the fact that he chose to prey on sex workers, that's another common thread we see in a lot of serial killer cases. It's this, like, disturbing dehumanization, like a way to justify their actions by saying, these women are less than human.
It's like they think their lives don't matter as much, that they won't be missed.
Yeah, or that people won't care if they disappear. But then you add this whole denial layer on top of it, and it makes Johnson's case even weirder, even more confusing.
Right, because that whole thing about not sleeping with a woman since 1982, it just doesn't make any sense with the DNA evidence.
Right. It's like, did he really believe that? Or was he just messing with everyone?
Maybe he just created this whole alternate reality in his head,
Yeah.
one where he's not responsible for what he did.
It's possible. Denial is a really powerful coping mechanism, especially when you're dealing with such huge amounts of trauma and guilt. But we also have to remember that Johnson had a history of seizures, and he had an intellectual disability. So those factors, they have to be considered too, right? But it's like, how much did those things contribute to his actions, and how much is that just a dangerous oversimplification?
Yeah, it's a tough question. You don't want to just say, oh, because he had seizures, he became a killer. It's never that black and white.
Definitely not. Human behavior is way too complicated for that.
But you also can't just ignore those factors completely.
No, of course not. They were part of who he was, part of his life.
So maybe it's not about cause and effect.
Maybe it's more like all these different things coming together at the same time, like a perfect storm.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like all these different pieces of the puzzle, his childhood, the escalating crimes, the seizures, the intellectual disability, who knows what else. And they all come together to create this one horrific picture.
Yeah, and we might never have all the pieces of that puzzle.
Right, but we can still try to figure out as much as we can.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole thing so frustrating, but also so fascinating, right? We're always going to have more questions than answers when it comes to cases like this. But that doesn't mean we should stop looking for those answers. We need to keep trying to understand these things, why people do these things.
So if we can't totally figure out Johnson's motives, if we can't really grasp his denial, what can we actually learn from this case?
Well, for one thing, I think it really highlights how important early intervention is. If people had taken those early crimes more seriously, if there had been more support for him, maybe, just maybe things could have gone differently.
Yeah, maybe it wouldn't have escalated to murder. It makes you think.
It really does. And it's a reminder that, we need to focus on preventing these things from happening in the first place, not just punishing people after the fact.
So it's not just about the criminal justice system.
Right. It's about rehabilitation. It's about creating systems that help people, that get to the root of the problem, that understand why people commit crimes in the first place. And it's about recognizing that even in these really dark cases, there's still a human story there, a story that might be able to help us prevent future tragedies.
Yeah, it's easy to just focus on the sensationalism of a case like this.
Right.
But we have to remember that there are real people involved, the victims, their families, and, yeah, even the perpetrator.
Exactly. We have to ask ourselves, like, what kind of society lets people get to this point? What are we doing or not doing that contributes to these horrible events?
It's a question that goes way beyond just the courts and the prisons,
Just about poverty,
inequality,
mental health.
all the big issues that we're facing as a society.
Absolutely. And there are no easy answers, but we have to be willing to talk about these things. We have to
Right.
work together to find solutions.
So for everyone listening, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. If you want to learn more about Matthew Stephen Johnson, we've got links to the Wikipedia article, the court documents, and some news articles.
Yeah, check those out and, form your own opinions. But remember, critical thinking is really important when you're looking at complex stuff like this. Don't just take everything you hear as fact. Do your own research. Ask questions. And be open to different points of view.
So before we wrap up this deep dive into the life and crimes of Matthew Stephen Johnson, I want to leave you with one last question to think about. Knowing how brutal his crimes were, knowing how much he denied everything, what does this case tell us about how much we can really understand about the criminal mind? Can we ever really get inside the head of someone like that, especially when they refuse to admit what they did? It's a question that really makes you think, Like, are there just some parts of the human mind that we're never going to understand?
It's a scary thought. And to be honest, there might not be an easy answer.
Yeah.
But I think that's what makes these cases so interesting, so important to study.
Right, it's like we're trying to solve this puzzle.
But some of the pieces are missing.
Exactly, and we might never find all the pieces.
Yeah.
But every new piece of information, every different perspective,
It gets us a little bit closer.
closer understanding how people work, why they do the things they do.
And that's where you come in.
Wow.
You've heard all the details about this case. You've heard what the experts think. But now it's time to, think for yourself.
Exactly. What did you take away from all of this? What questions are still bugging you?
Because that's what a deep dive like this is all about. It's not about giving you all the answers.
It's about making you curious.
It's about making you think.
Challenging what you thought you knew.
Exactly. And it's about encouraging you to keep learning, keep exploring these complicated issues. Because remember, there's no one right way to look at this case. There are so many different layers, so many different perspectives.
Yeah, it's not black and white.
So as you're reading through those resources, the ones we mentioned in the show notes,
The Wikipedia article, the court documents.
keep asking yourself those tough questions. What made Johnson do these things? Could it have been stopped? And what can we learn from all of this? What can we learn about, the limits of what we know about the human mind?
These are tough questions.
Yeah.
And there might not be any easy answers.
But they're worth thinking about. Because maybe, just maybe, thinking about these things will help us understand ourselves a little better.
And understand the world around us.
Exactly. Well, thanks for coming along on this deep dive into the case of Matthew Stephen Johnson. We hope you learned something new.
And that you have even more questions now than you did before.
And most importantly, that you're still curious about all the mysteries of the human mind.